Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, it was a big challenge. I mean, it's like this, you're taking a command economy, a formerly totalitarian system. You've got all these kind of, you might say, psychological issues. They're adjusting to suddenly not being considered one of the world's two superpowers. You would ideally like them to move in a democratic direction. I don't think that's truly a prerequisite for world peace, as some people do, but you like it. I mean, there's a lot going on there. It just seems to me hard to imagine that they didn't say, we need some like task forces. We need the world's greatest minds figuring out how we're going to accomplish this. They just thought it would all happen naturally.
And they didn't. They didn't, period. The idea started in 1992 under Bush 1 with Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Cheney, that this is now the time for the U.S. to lead the world, to be the global hegemon. That was the idea. For Clinton, the idea was, I don't know what. Presidents don't understand much anyway in the first year or two of their administrations, and Clinton was certainly like that. But they said no heroics. You know, it's domestic politics anyway, no heroics. And so, no, nothing of a big, ambitious scale was done. That was what I believed in because I knew enough of history I knew a lot of history, I have to say, of the end of World War I and the disasters that ensued, and the end of World War II and the constructive approach that had ensued. And I wanted this to be a constructive approach. But the U.S. already had decided in 1992, this is going to be a U.S.-led world. We're going to start expanding NATO. Russia is, going to be a bit player. We just have to make sure the nukes don't go off. But other than that, we don't have to pay too much attention. And of course, they had no conception of how China was going to rise during this period. But what I would say in brief is that from 1992 until today, the U.S. grand strategy has been to be the top dog with no rival. And of course, it's a ridiculous idea compared to the idea of a decent world that cooperates and that tries to overcome poverty and that faces climate change and so forth. The U.S. grand strategy is not about ending climate change. It's not about economic development. It's not about ending poverty. It's not about peace. The U.S. grand strategy is that the United States needs to be the predominant country in the world, period. And we have two rivals in this vision. One is the big one, China, and the other one is what they think of as a kind of sideshow, but it's not quite a sideshow. It's 11 time zones, and it's a country with 1,700 deployed nuclear weapons, and we're at war with it. That's Russia. And the U.S. view is, no, this is the U.S. world. And that is in both parties. In the Republican Party, it was the Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz world. In the Democratic Party, it's been the Democratic Party neocons. By the way, Victoria Nuland, our Undersecretary of State, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Biden. They've been part of that all along.
Are you saying they all deserve the label? This is a technical issue, neocon, or you're just saying that it's more or less the same foreign policy, whatever you call it?
A little bit of both. But, when I say it, people are shocked. Jeff, what are you talking about? How could you call Biden a neocon? A congressman just basically took my head off a little bit for saying that. But the fact of the matter is, look, Biden, Nuland, and Sullivan were part of the overthrow of the Ukrainian president in 2014 that really started this war in its violent phase. So, yes, they've been part of the idea that what's really at stake is a U.S.-led world. For me, it doesn't compute. What's really at stake, in my view, is a cooperative world operating under the UN Charter and taking steps to end poverty and fight climate change and other environmental disasters. But it's a very different view. Basically, most of Washington is organized around the U.S. must lead view. And it's out of date. It's anachronistic. It was wrong in 1992. It's wildly out of date today because it's no longer even based on a U.S. economic or technological predominance, given China's rise. So it gets more and more dangerous every day because it's completely out of sync with ground reality.
Yeah. Well, your reference to the UN Charter is what I had in mind when I said there was hope of international law maybe actually being respected. I was thinking in particular the ban on transborder aggression and in the charter. But on the issue of where the impetus for this foreign policy comes from, let me challenge you a little in the sense that, as you know, in the 90s, there were leading lights of the foreign policy establishment who said NATO expansion is a terrible idea. So yet Clinton did it. Now, one thing I've heard is that as the 96 election approached, he very much wanted to nail down some votes from people of Eastern European descent in the Midwest, whatever. I've heard, knowledgeable people say that. But that was a moment when there certainly wasn't consensus in the foreign policy establishment for NATO expansion. And yet it happened. I agree with you. It was a mistake. And in general, one could go through and point to ways specific domestic issues have warped U.S. foreign policy. But anyway, you hold to the view that in the, quote, deep state, I mean, maybe you want to avoid that phrase. Actually, I'd probably advise you to avoid it. But you know what I mean.
Yes.
You go ahead.
Actually, it is a historian that I can't name because he hasn't come out with this yet, was telling me recently that in his archival work, he has uncovered documents already in 1992 with the list of countries to which NATO will expand, including Ukraine, 1992. And I'm trying to find right now, if I can, while we talk, an article by, oh yes, this is fascinating, an article by Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Let me just read a little bit of it quickly. Accordingly, NATO and EU enlargement should move forward in deliberate stages, assuming a sustained American and Western European commitment. Here is a speculative but realistic timetable. By 1999, the first 3 Central European members will have been admitted into NATO. By 2003, the EU is likely to have initiated accession talks with all 3 Baltic republics, and NATO will likewise have moved forward on their membership as well as that of Romania and Bulgaria, with their accession likely to be completed before 2005. Between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine, provided it has made significant domestic reforms and has been identified as Central European country, should also be ready for initial negotiations with the EU and NATO. Well, Bob, that's exactly the timetable. That's not a casual paragraph.
Yeah.
That is actually officialdom giving us a little bit behind the curtain of what the plans are.
Now, that's Brzezinski in 97. He's 97. No longer in power.
No, he's no longer in power, but he's presenting at Foreign Affairs magazine, which is, the magazine for
that's
for the New York Council on Foreign Relations people. And my point is this: this is really a long-term strategy. It's Clinton. Yeah, he went along with it, but it was presented to him, no doubt. It was, and by the way, Bill Perry, like you said, his defense secretary, almost resigned over it. He thought it was horrible. George Kennan said this is the biggest mistake of our generation. But it's a deep plan, and it was set in motion, and it's still in motion to this day, even though it has led us to war. That's amazing. Not only has it led us to war, but while we're talking about it on your podcast, the New York Times won't talk about it. The Washington Post won't talk about it. The Wall Street Journal won't talk about it. MSNBC won't talk about it. Nobody will talk about it in the mainstream media.
Yeah. Let me just quickly say one thing I had heard is that during the Bush 1 administration, voices of reason like Brent Scowcroft actually beat back the neocons on the NATO expansion issue. But ultimately, the neocons prevailed. There was some continuity of personnel and so on. Of course, Brzezinski, not a neocon really, but he has his own issues with Russia. God knows. You mentioned the media. Is it my?
It's interesting, just in terms of continuity. Consider Victoria Nuland. She's our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs.
She was in the Cheney.
Exactly. She was a Cheney National Security Advisor. Then she was the NATO, U.S. ambassador to NATO under Bush. Then she was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and her call was intercepted as she planned the post-Yanukovych government because she was deeply involved in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Now she is Undersecretary of State, and she's married to the leading author, ideologue of liberal hegemony, as he calls it, Robert Kagan. So that's continuity, by the way. That is literal continuity of one person across both parties going back now almost 20 years.
Quick 30-second anecdote. When the Obama administration brought her on, I was running a blog at the point called The Progressive Realist, and we ran an item saying, wait, what's going on? She's like a neocon. She was plotting with Cheney, and Obama is bringing her on board. We were pilloried across the foreign policy establishment. Left, right. How dare you, question, like what? Just because she's married to Bob Kagan? Well, no, it was deeper than that. But the point is, everyone in the blob rallies round everyone else in the blob. And
that's it. This is deep. This is really deep, and it's got a lot of continuity, and the continuity now is extremely dangerous because it's so anachronistic. We don't understand to this moment that we think we're leading the world parade, but 80% of the world saying, huh? What? Who are you to lead the world parade? We've got, yes, the US, Canada, Britain, European Union, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. That's our list. Okay, that's a list that is 15 to 20% of the world population. And the rest of the world, like President Lula, who was just in China, and the Saudis, and you name it, because they were just with China also, and China just brokered peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The rest of India, the rest of the world saying, no, the U.S. isn't our leader, but we'd like to get along with you. And that's where we have this basic discontinuity right now. And we keep pushing NATO. And it just doesn't make sense.
Now, Jeff, I know you've got a heart out, as they say in the business, like right now. So if you don't have time to answer this, just don't or give it a one-word answer. But is it my imagination, or you mentioned the media? Has the media actually gotten worse in some sense? I mean, it always
without question.
Well, and how would you characterize that, and
why?
Without
question. So and by the way, I will tell you, when Nord Stream was blown up, I had a chat with a longtime friend and actually a classmate of mine from Harvard from decades ago, who was a senior reporter in one of the most important newspapers. I said, you know what? I think the U.S. did it. And he said, of course the U.S. did it. Who else? And I said, maybe your paper could mention something like that. And just today said the Russians did it. He said, oh, come on, Jeff, come on. I said, are you kidding? We have a serious discussion of this? And he said to me, the editor's not so interested in that. And I said, this is a friend from decades. I said, when I was young, I turned to your newspaper because of Watergate, because of the Pentagon Papers, and I loved it. And he said to me, that paper is so dead and gone, Jeff, you have to understand that. And I cannot imagine, this is a really talented guy, lead columnist, lead journalist, I should say. And he's telling me the paper that I loved is dead and gone. If you ask me why, I really cannot figure it out, why a paper doesn't want to beat the government over the head when it tells ridiculous stories like Nord Stream was blown up by 6 people on a boat, like they tried for one day. Okay, come on. This was put out by serious media because it was almost a joke from the intelligence agency. Why these media are so in line with official narratives, I don't fully understand. I know all the theories, money, advertising, power, many other things. But the truth is, it's dreadful compared to what it was 40 years ago. Dreadful. And it's gotten a lot worse.
Yeah, I think there are a few factors, but I do think the actual conception of a journalist's mission, what the journalist's conception of their mission is, has in some cases, not all, but actually changed. When
I was young, which is a long time ago, we knew the government lied nonstop. And the idea of journalism was pick out the lies. That was fun. And not fun only, crucial, like the Pentagon Papers in the Vietnam War, like Watergate. And now you don't get any sense of that, because if you're somewhat experienced, and also I'm lucky to have daily conversations with a lot of people who are in the know because of their responsibilities. So I know a lot of what goes on day to day. I don't see any will in the mainstream media to start from the basic proposition that, okay, politicians lie, that's their job, but our job is to tell the truth. That, to me, is a great division of labor. I'm not even expecting politicians to stop lying. I'm just expecting the media not just to parrot the lies.